Well, it looks like we might get a little rain out there. I will watch the windows and keep you abreast if the storm comes. Last week, as David and I were starting our journey from Florida to California, we were about an hour and a half in, and he had a blowout on one of the inside tires on the back end of that RV. And we ended up pulling over to a rest area in Alabama. In fact, it was mile 1 of Alabama. I mean, we just barely made it. In fact, the blowout was still in Florida, and we made it to the rest stop, and we thought, well, it's about 11:30. Let's go get something to eat. And so we got back on the interstate in his little truck, and we went down, and the next exit was mile 13, so 12 miles away. We ate lunch, and we were coming back, and it was starting to look like it could rain. And going eastbound on I-10, there's not an exit for that rest area, so you have to go past it. And about the time we got to even with the rest area, the storm hit. And Dave had left the vents open in the top of the RV so hopefully it would stay cool. And it was pouring rain. We could see the RV, but we had to go another 5 miles down the road to get to an exit to turn around and come back another 5 miles to get there. By the time we got there, everything inside was soaked. And thankfully, the mattress in the bed there, he left the plastic wrap on the mattress, and I had to sleep on it that first night. I was thinking, man, let's take this plastic off. But that second day, I was sure glad we left the plastic on. So we just had to wash the linens. It was an interesting time. It was a good time to be with my son and the trials that we went through. But I guess whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And certainly we were challenged in ways that we did not expect, and yet he is in California now at Edwards Air Force Base. He's getting settled in there. He had to report in on Tuesday, but he doesn't actually start work for about another 10 days. So sometime this next week, I think he goes to work for real. So keep him in your prayers. I hadn't talked to him today. He had a couple of churches he was going to look at today, so I don't know where he went or how things went there. But do pray for him that he'll find a good church to be a part of, and that he'll be able to work for the Lord. And they told him that he'll likely be there for about 3 years, so he's there for a while. And it is, it's the deserts of California. I guess it wasn't Death Valley, so it wasn't that bad. But it was like 107 degrees or something, so I can't imagine how bad it could get. This is our second Sunday night of the month, and so we are going to be looking at Christian evidences, an apology of the faith, we might say. And I think one of the things that we often hear a lot about when it comes to evidences of the Bible or the evidences of God is we hear about archaeology. And what we have to understand is that archaeology cannot prove the Bible to be true. The Bible's true regardless of what archaeology does. But what archaeology can do is come in and support the biblical narrative, and oftentimes it does. For example, apologists will never find food fragments left over after the feeding of the 5,000. Those are long gone. It's food, it's perishable, it's gone. I doubt we could even find the baskets. And if we found baskets that someone said, these are one of the 12 baskets, you can mark it down, it probably ain't, right? We don't have those things. We will not find footprints solidified in the water after Peter walking on the water. Water doesn't solidify that way, and so we can't expect to find that. Many of the miracles and the deeds of Jesus did not leave discoverable mementos behind for archaeologists to find, to dig in the right place at the right time to the right depth and simply find them. But through the years, we can say that archaeologists have uncovered artifacts and treasures that support the biblical narrative. For example, in 1906, after years of questioning whether the Bible was right in its depiction of the Hittite nation, whether or not the Hittites even existed, much less had interaction with the Jews, or at least Abraham, who bought the burial plot for his wife Sarah from Ephron the Hittite, Genesis chapter 23. And yet in 1906, they found not one, but a library of clay tablets that were written in cuneiform writing that were attributed to the Hittite people. Not only was it that the Hittites did really exist, but there were actual legal documents and contracts between the Hittite people, and get this, the Israelite people. And so, as a matter of fact, they did have interaction with the people of God. In 1930, Colonel Taylor discovered what is referred to as the Annals of Sennacherib. It was a 6-sided clay prism, and it's inscribed with all the many deeds and tales of Sennacherib and what he was able to do when he was king of the Assyrians. And so that Annals of Sennacherib is one of those amazing discoveries. And in fact, in the Annals, he talks about capturing or taking into captive many cities and towns of Judah, and that he besieged the city of Jerusalem like a bird in the cage, and that he was offered money to go away. And of course, in the biblical text, we find that Hezekiah paid tribute to Sennacherib, and he left the city alone. And so there again is a point of contact between archaeology and the scriptures, and it certainly upholds what we see in the biblical record. Another important discovery was the unearthing of what is referred to today as simply the Cyrus cylinder. This is much larger than actual size. The Cyrus cylinder is about 9 inches long, and so it's not a huge stone. You can imagine, the smaller an item is, the more difficult it is to unearth. And yet when it was unearthed in 1879, people immediately began to fawn over this contact with the biblical narrative. But to really understand that importance, we need to know why Cyrus himself is so important to biblical history. And so tonight we're going to look at Cyrus and the cylinder. It begins, of course, with a nation in peril. In the 10th century BC, it brought Israel to what we might say the apex of its history. It was at its greatest point of philosophy, the greatest point of history, its greatest point of prosperity. Everything seemed to be going well under King Solomon. In fact, the Queen of Sheba, when she came, she testified to how great it was. She came and she said that she had heard all of the things that there was, and she saw the house that he had built, and the food of his tables, the seating of his officials, the attendance of his servants, their clothing, his cupbearers, and his burnt offerings that he offered at the house of the Lord. There was no more breath in her. It took her breath away when she saw the opulence of the nation of Israel at that moment. And she said to the king, "The report that was true that I heard in my own land of your words and of your wisdom, but I did not believe the reports. They were incredible to me. I did not believe them until I came, and my own eyes had seen it." And she says, "And behold, the half was not told me." I thought it was incredible what I heard, and when I get here, it's twice what I heard. And I've seen it with my own eyes. Your wisdom and your prosperity surpass the report that I heard. That from 1 Kings 10, verses 4 through 7. Yet Solomon, as great a king and as wise as he was in the ways of God, struggled with personal righteousness. Just one example came in 1 Kings 11 and verse 3 when it speaks of his 700 wives and 300 concubines. That simply proves to us that Solomon was not as wise as he thought he was. Well, that and polygamy was a sin before God even then. This helped to set the nation, I think, on a path of decay and destruction. The kingdom was divided, and the two nations, it seemed they tried to outdo one another in running away from God and his statutes. They turned to idols and the false gods of their national neighbors, gods like Baal and Molech and the Ashtoreth, many others that they found in order to make alliances and friendships with the other nations. During this time in world history, it was very common for every nation to have its own national gods. The gods were used to explain the origins of man. It was used to explain the purpose of man. It was oftentimes used to, gods were used to give personalities to great things that they saw, like the sun and the moon and the stars, to the rivers, to the lakes, to the rocks. And so the idea of these national gods, those were the explanations of these people and how they understood things, and they would pass those traditions down. But each nation basically had their own, and Israel was living in an area was surrounded by other nations, and in order to make friends with them, they would often accept their false gods and accept their idols. The political and religious leaders abandoned their post. We see Isaiah 1 and verse 23, your princes are rebels and companions of thieves. When you look at the political leaders and you say about them that they are rebels and that they are companions of thieves, these are not good words. We're saying that the leaders had corrupted themselves. Jeremiah put it this way in Jeremiah 1, beginning in verse 18, and I, behold, I will make you this day a fortified city. God is actually talking to Jeremiah, telling him, I'm going to make you this fortified city, a pillar of iron, bronze walls against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests, and the people of the land. And they will fight against you, but they will not prevail against you, for I am with you, declares the Lord, to deliver you. He says, look, I'm sending you to a bunch of hooligans. I'm sending you to people who are not righteous, people that do not want to know the ways of God. But I'm going to make you stronger than they are. It's very similar to the words which he spoke to Ezekiel too, when he told, Son of man, you go and I'm going to make your head as hard as a diamond. And they're going to know that there was a prophet among them. Isn't it interesting that God is telling his prophets, when you go to these people, be prepared, because it's not a good situation. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and others, that he's warning them about how bad the people actually are. Jeremiah lamented the moral decay of the people. Oh, that I had in the wilderness a traveler's lodging place, that I might leave my people and go away from them. You imagine the Jews who were fiercely patriotic, who considered themselves, of course, the apple of God's eye, and the main people they wanted to be around were other Jews. They considered people of the outside, the Gentile and pagan nations, to be lost, to be bad people, although they would accept their gods, but they frowned upon relationships with other people. And Jeremiah says, I'd rather be with other people. I want to leave my people and go away from them. Why? For they are adulterers, a company of treacherous men. They bend their tongues like a bow. Falsehood and not truth has grown strong in the land. For they proceed from evil to evil, and they do not know me, declares the Lord. Let everyone beware of his neighbor, and put no trust in any brother. For every brother is a deceiver, and every neighbor goes about to slander. Everyone deceives his neighbor, and no one speaks the truth. They have taught their tongues to speak lies. They weary themselves, committing iniquity, heaping oppression upon oppression and deceit upon deceit. They refuse to know me, declares the Lord. Jeremiah looks and he says, things are getting bad, really bad. That's Jeremiah 9, 2 through 6. But the peril, understand, was not from foreign gods. It's interesting, the prophets often warned about the coming of other nations to punish them, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and so forth. But the real peril was not from the other nations. The real peril was from their sins. The sins which they chose to commit in separating themselves from God. That was why they were a nation in peril. And what we understand and learn from all of this is that it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. Hebrews 10 and verse 31. God used a series of prophets to warn the two nations of their impending destruction as a result of their sin. To the northern kingdom, God promised destruction without a remnant at the hands of the Assyrians. Sennacherib, the king that we mentioned a moment ago in the annals of Sennacherib the king of Assyria, routed the promised land, destroyed the northern kingdom just as promised. As Amos prophesied in chapter 4 and verse 2, behold, the days are coming upon you when they will take you away with hooks, even the last one of you with fish hooks. Nothing was going to be left of the northern kingdom. But to the southern kingdom, God promised a limited exile of 70 years and a return to the promised land by a remnant of the Jews. This whole land, God said, shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation. Jeremiah 25, 11 and 12. While the 70 years of exile would be brutal and difficult and even deadly, there was hope. There was light at the end of the tunnel. That light, God put a name on. In Isaiah 44 and Isaiah 45, that name was the name of Cyrus. Cyrus he called my shepherd. In his promise of restoration and the repatriation of the Jews, God mentions Cyrus, or King Cyrus of Persia, by name. Thus says the Lord, your Redeemer, who says of Jerusalem, she shall be inhabited, and of the cities of Judah, they shall be built, and I will raise up their ruins. Who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd. He shall fulfill all my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple, your foundation shall be laid. Isaiah 44, 24 through 28. God chose Cyrus to be a shepherd, that is, a leader to his people. Not that Cyrus was going to lead them in the paths of righteousness, but he was going to lead them back into the purpose of God, which was that they would return to the land after 70 years. Cyrus would fulfill God's purpose to rebuild Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, and Cyrus would also support the rebuilding of the temple of God. He is saying that she shall be built. It's interesting, the idea that Cyrus would actually pay for the rebuilding of the temple of God and the cities. In Isaiah 45, the very next chapter, God tells more of Cyrus, calling him anointed in verse 1, whose right hand I have grasped, verse 1, whose way is prepared by God, in verse 2, who is called by name, verses 3 and 4. Though Cyrus does not know God, God says, I named him. Not only do I call him by name, I named him. God using his providence and his power to be sure that Cyrus's parents would name him Cyrus to fulfill the very words of this prophecy. Though Cyrus did not know God, he named him in verse 4. And in verse 5, he says, though he did not know me, I equipped him. I gave him what he needed to accomplish my purpose. History records the feats of Cyrus the Great, also known as Cyrus II. He sacked Babylon and overthrew the Chaldean nation, just as God said would happen. History suggests, though there are some who doubt this, there are many who still believe this, that the Euphrates River, which ran beneath the wall of Babylon to supply water to the city on the inside, that Cyrus was able to divert the river and march his army in the riverbed beneath the wall. And he sacked Babylon in that way. And this was, of course, right after God did the handwriting on the wall to Belshazzar. Mene, tekel, upharsin. You've been weighed in the balances and you've been numbered. You've been found wanting. And there's judgment that was coming. And that judgment, of course, was Cyrus, who had already been born and already risen to power among the Persians. One of the most remarkable deeds of Cyrus in the Bible was his repatriation of the Israelites and other nations as well. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that a word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. In Ezra chapter 1 and verse 1, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put in writing, thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem, and let each survivor, in whatever place he sojourns, be assisted by the men of this place with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides freewill offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Now for generations, that decree recorded in Ezra 1, 2 through 4, Bible skeptics were incredulous. There's no way that a king is going to release his slaves and send them back home. It just wouldn't happen that way. No king would send them home and tell them, rebuild your cities. No king would send them home and say, restore your worship. Remember the national gods, the deities. The deity, the main deity of the Persians was Ahura Mazda. And most conquering nations forced those who were subject and tribute to them to worship their gods, Ahura Mazda and others. It wouldn't say, go home and worship your own God. I mean, after all, the gods of those who've been subjected are weak and impotent gods. You need to worship the God who has given us victory. He's the powerful one. He is the strong one. No one would do that. And not only would they not tell them to restore their worship, they really wouldn't pay for the rebuilding of the wall and the rebuilding of the temple. It's farcical. And yet in 1897, with the discovery of the Cyrus cylinder, that opinion changed on a dime. The 9-inch tall cylinder was inscribed with Cyrus's edict of liberation, repatriating peoples held captive by the Babylonians. So what does it say? The cylinder, for example, ascribes Cyrus's success to Marduk, the Babylonian god. We'll have a little more to say about that later. Not the Persian god of Ahura Mazda, but to Marduk, who is the Babylonian god. Which we would almost expect, because Cyrus does not know God, does he? I mean, isn't that exactly what God said in Isaiah 45, 4 and 5? Though he does not know me. We don't have in the Bible an account of Cyrus converting to Judaism. He's still Cyrus, king of the Persians. He is still a pagan, and he still looks to pagan gods. And so we're not surprised that on the cylinder it's ascribed not to Yahweh, but to another god. Marduk pronounced the name of Cyrus and made him king of Persia, the cylinder says. What did God say? I call you by your name. I name you, though you do not know me. I equip you, though you do not know me. In the cylinder, it says that the God named Cyrus. In the biblical text, it says that God named Cyrus. The cylinder says, Marduk, the great Lord, a protector of his people, beheld with pleasure his good deeds, talking about Cyrus's good deeds, his upright mind, and therefore ordered him to march against his city Babylon. God says, whose right hand I grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings. Isaiah 45 and verse 1. The cylinder says, Marduk, the great Lord, was well pleased with my deeds and sent friendly blessings to myself, Cyrus, the king who worships him, to Cambyses, my son, the offspring of my loins as well. Isaiah 48, beginning in verse 14, says, the Lord loves him. He shall perform his purpose on Babylon, obviously talking about Cyrus, although it's not given there by name. And his arm shall be against the Chaldeans. I, even I, have spoken and called him. I have brought him, and he will prosper in his way. God says, I'm leading him because of who he is. Here's probably the most significant part of the cylinder. I return to these sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which have been ruins for a long time, the images which used to live therein, and established for them permanent sanctuaries. I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned to them their habitations. Furthermore, I resettled upon the command of Marduk, the great Lord, all the gods of Sumer and Akkad, whom Nabonidus had brought into Babylon to the anger of the Lord of the gods, unharmed in their former chapels, the places which make them happy. What is he saying? I'm letting people go home. I'm letting them rebuild their sanctuaries, their worship centers, to reestablish their religion as they had always known it. And of course, from the decree of Cyrus, recorded in Ezra, the Lord, the God of heavens, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem, and let each survivor, in whatever place he sojourns, be assisted by men of this place with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, and free, besides free will offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. You may say, well, wait a minute, it's not word for word. Okay? I don't know how many of you are bilingual, but it's very difficult to do word for word because different language not only have different words for different objects or things, they have different syntax. Sentences don't run the same way. Words oftentimes can have multiple meanings. And so in the art of translation, and you might say, well, it's a science of translation. There is science to it and there is art to it. That's the thing. It's an artful science or a scientific art. I don't know how you want to put it, but either way, there's definitely some art and skill to translation. So we're going from one language, the Persian language, into, by the way, the Cyrus cylinder is not written in Persian. It's written in Akkadian, which is Babylonian. We're going from Persia into the Akkadian language, and we're comparing that to the Aramaic or the Hebrew. And so not only do you have two languages going on, you have three, possibly even four, that are happening at this time. And so we don't really expect it to be word for word. Some might come along and say, yeah, but in the Bible it ascribes it to Yahweh, but in the cylinder it ascribes it to Marduk. That is true. But again, because he didn't know Yahweh, we don't expect him to ascribe anything to Yahweh. The other side of this coin is that many scholars are divided on the authenticity of the cylinder in reference to its origin. Some claim that it is Cyrus paying tribute to the Babylonian god Marduk in his decree because Marduk has allowed him to defeat the Babylonians. But that's kind of odd because other Persian kings that come after Cyrus attribute to Ahura Mazda all of their victories. And so some have suggested that instead of originating from Cyrus, that it really originated from maybe the priests of Babylon, those who had been defeated, and they're trying to explain why they were defeated. Because our god, Marduk, sided with Cyrus. Maybe so. But the date still reaches back to the late 6th century, early 5th century BCE. It still comes from the same time frame. No one's debating whether or not it's authentic as far as capturing the gist of the decree. We're just wondering why would Cyrus, who worships Ahura Mazda, ascribe his victories to Marduk? Now, as the Romans and the Greeks did, if you know anything about Roman and Greek mythology, you take like the god Zeus, who is also known as the god Jupiter by the Romans. And we look at that and we say, well, it's the same God. Well, it's the same divine position, we might say. For the Greeks, when they were worshiping Zeus, would not say Zeus, also known as Jupiter by the Romans. It was just Zeus. And the Romans, they just worshiped Jupiter. But when the two civilizations came together or clashed, they would say, well, who's your head god? Well, our head god's Zeus. Well, our head god's Jupiter. Well, we'll say they're the same guy. And that's how one religion would assimilate others. Is it possible that was going on even during the time of the Persians' defeat of the Babylonians, and they're simply recognizing Marduk was the supreme god according to the Babylonians, which equates to the supreme god of Ahura Mazda of the Persians? Maybe that's all that we see that is actually going on with Cyrus and the cylinder. Regardless of who produced it, though, it is an authentic witness to the reforms of Cyrus. Many Akkadian scholars say Cyrus was the first king to establish human rights. In fact, today, if you start looking up human rights, any article is going to, any good article on human rights, talking about the history of human rights, will go at least as far back as Cyrus. Because this was revolutionary. That's why before the finding of the Cyrus cylinder, people were so incredulous about what the Bible said Cyrus did. That's not what kings do. And yet that's exactly what Cyrus did, which makes him the father of human rights. And so he is often cited that way. So what was once farcical is now not only accepted but celebrated, because eventually it would lead to our human rights that we have today and recognize in our country. All was declared, of course, by God before it ever happened. Wish we had time to go into a lengthy discussion of Isaiah 48, beginning in verse 3 and following, but God basically says in this passage, look, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen about the fall of Babylon and about the rise of Cyrus and about him sending my people home. I'm going to tell you about it now 150 years earlier, so that when it does happen, you know it was me. And he said, not only that, but when it does happen, there's going to be all kinds of people who say, yeah, our God made it happen. This God made it happen. This idol made it happen. And he said, but you're going to know I made it happen. And if nothing else, the Cyrus cylinder does, you have these competing gods of Ahura Mazda and Marduk and the other sanctuaries and other gods that he makes reference to. And they're saying, look, this is who did it. This is who did it. Just as God said. And God said, I'm telling you now, so you'll know I'm the one who did it. Today, our faith in God is strengthened by the specificity and the reliability of God's word. The Cyrus cylinder is a phenomenal piece of history that supports God in all of his power. It's a witness to what God was able to do. I hope that in studying this one piece of artifact of history, that your faith has been strengthened, that you see that how archaeology can support or lend weight and witness to the biblical narrative. And what an awesome one this is. Not just that God named Cyrus, but God says, when you see it happen, remember, this was it. Listen, our history, we look back in history and we saw what happened. And it ought to strengthen our faith and bring us closer to the Creator who wants us. Tonight, if you are not a child of God, you have an opportunity to respond to his invitation. Or if you are, maybe you've just grown weak or stale in your faith and you would like some sort of rejuvenation, that comes from the encouragement of your brothers and sisters in Christ. If you have a need to avail yourself of what the church offers to you, won't you respond to his invitation while we stand and sing?